I mentioned in the very first entry into this series that I grew up watching espionage thrillers with my dad. Spies are pretty cool, and while I'm aware that most statecraft and spycraft isn't as glamorous or as sexy or as cool as what we see in the movies, there was always one provocateur who made it seem effortless. He walked into a situation and immediately seemed to dominate the room, controlled the situation, and easily adapted with the finesse and grace of an expert dancer. Of course, I'm talking about Ian Fleming's flagship character, James Bond, codenamed 007. I grew up watching many of the Bond movies with my father, and I was always intrigued by the cool secret gadgets and the sleek sports car modded in such a way it made the Batmobile blush. And I'm always amazed when I see the tech from the movies make its way to the real world in some way, shape, or form. I'm still waiting for my Apple Watch to have a built-in laser cutter on launch, but that's just me. This particular essay is going to break down the character, the books, yes, the films started as novels, the films, as well as the man who made the man, Ian Fleming himself. We'll discuss the literary themes that permeate the stories and how they were adapted from the books to the films. Ian Lancaster Fleming worked in Britain's Naval Intelligence Division during the Second World War, as well as a journalist and wartime correspondent. He was involved in the planning of Operation GoldenEye, which was a plan to monitor Spain after a possible alliance between the Axis powers and Francisco Franco. The goal was to conduct sabotage operations on Spanish soil. Since there was no German takeover of Spain like there had been in France and in parts of Central Europe, nor was there a German invasion of Gibraltar, the intelligence division shelved the project, and the name GoldenEye was used by Fleming for his Jamaican estate, as well as the title of the first Bond film featuring the newly cast Pierce Brosnan. Fleming also planned and oversaw two intelligence units, 30 Assault Unit, a commando unit, and T-Force, a program designed to loot German intellectual assets and impede Germany's ability to compete in post-war politics and economics while preventing advanced Nazi tech from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. Fleming published his first Bond novel, Casino Royale, in 1952, at age 44, and it was such a hit, his publisher printed 3 runs to keep up with the demand. Since 1952, Fleming wrote a total of 10 more novels and 2 collections of short stories, though several of the titles didn't get published until after the author's passing in 1964. Fleming used his wartime experiences to color in the background and details of James Bond's world. While he based Bond's appearance and skill sets off of friends and colleagues from his time in the service, given Bond's propensity for heavy drinking and smoking and gambling, it would be safe to assume there is some of Fleming's own personality in the character as well. James Bond was featured in a total of 13 titles officially written by Fleming. He has also been the central character in 27 films, portrayed by 6 actors, and has been featured in several video games, many of which were adaptations of films from the mid-90s through the early 2000s. The character first appeared in 1952's Casino Royale. Going by the codename 007, he is a commander in the Royal Navy Reserve. The character himself, as briefly mentioned before, is an amalgam of intelligence officers and operatives Fleming met during his own real espionage experiences. Bond was named after an ornithologist Fleming once knew, and the name sounded vaguely Anglo-Saxon while still being blunt, strong, and masculine. He'd be a neutral figure despite the exotic things happening to and around him. Bond's appearance resembles American singer Hoagy Carmichael and Fleming's own. He is described as being tall, somewhat athletic, having black hair, blue-gray eyes, a curl of hair falling over his brow, a thin vertical scar on his right cheek, and a skin graft on one of his hands in the shape of the Cyrillic symbol for spy in Russian. While most audiences know Bond mostly for his drinking, womanizing, cool cars, and gadgets, the character is more than that. Fleming imbued Bond with many of his own personality traits, like the aforementioned drinking and smoking and gambling. But like his creator, Bond also enjoyed the same golf handicap, a love for scrambled eggs, and using the same brand of toiletries. A lot of these are details that are found in the books more so than in the films, but there is a great amount of detail into Bond's personal preferences and habits. Bond's background and family life didn't really get fleshed out until the next to last novel in the series, which was 1964's You Only Live Twice, in which Fleming incorporated the Scottish ancestry after seeing how well audiences liked Sean Connery in the 1962 film adaptation of Dr. No. Bond's humor turned dry because of it, and Bond's father was Scottish while his mother was from Vaud, Switzerland. This ancestry remained a staple through the films as well, briefly exploring Bond's parentage and ancestral home in the titular estate in the 2012 film Skyfall. While not the first title to be adapted into film, Casino Royale was the beginning of Fleming's written works in the post-war era, and the beginning of Bond's career as a spy. The book was released in April 1953, and it was a hit with readers looking for some fun and exciting escapism. But escapism grounded in the realities of the post-war intelligence world. Bond is tasked with infiltrating a baccarat tournament at the titular casino to bankrupt Le Chiffre, the treasurer of the French Union and a member of the Soviet Secret Service. He wins, and while being tortured for access to the funds by Le Chiffre, he encounters an assassin sent by the organization Smersh, who kills Le Chiffre and cuts the Cyrillic symbol into the back of Bond's hand to identify him as a spy to other Smersh agents. The book was followed up less than a year later with Live and Let Die, which spawned a great Paul McCartney song. Then a year after that was Moonraker, which was about a rocket, not a space laser. Then 1956's Diamonds Are Forever, then 1957's From Russia with Love. In these titles, Bond goes to America to deal with voodoo priest and Smersh agent Mr. Big, who is selling 17th century gold to finance Soviet spies. He stops ex-Nazi Hugo Drax from launching the world's first nuclear rocket at Britain's government. He returns to America to stop the Spangled Mob's diamond smuggling ring with ties back to Soviet espionage financing. And he becomes directly targeted by Smersh while traveling on the Orient Express with a supposed Russian defector who claims to be in love with him. He almost dies from poison in this fifth book. These first 5 titles have been dubbed the Smersh stories because the organization lurking in the background of the plots is dedicated to killing spies. Smersh is a Soviet acronym meaning death to spies. Each book explores the ramifications and the consequences of Bond's involvement and interruption of Soviet activities, most of which involved disrupting their various financial sources. Even Drax from Moonraker is a Soviet asset who is supposed to be building the titular rocket for his handlers while harboring ulterior plans of his own. Even 1958's Dr. No picks up on this idea of consequences. In the opening chapters, Bond is still being treated for the poisoning he experienced at the hands of Smersh in the book From Russia with Love. But this book takes him to Jamaica to investigate the disappearance of the station head for MI6 Station J and the man's secretary. This is where Bond meets the titular villain, Dr. Julius No, who has been sabotaging American rocket tests out of Cape Canaveral, Florida. Then we get Goldfinger in 1959. Like its predecessor, the book is named after the central villain, Auric Goldfinger, a gold smuggler MI6 suspects of financing Smersh with a plan to break into the U.S. gold reserves at Fort Knox. For Your Eyes Only released in 1960 and was the first to incorporate multiple short stories, including the shorts From a View to a Kill, For Your Eyes Only, Quantum of Solace, Risico, and The Hildebrand Rarity. Each short was a self-contained Bond adventure set between Goldfinger and 1961's Thunderball, in which Bond readers are first introduced to the terrorist organization Spectre, who hijacks 2 NATO nukes with plans to use the weapons to blackmail the world. The Spy Who Loved Me arrived in 1962, and it featured the only use of a first-person POV told from the perspective of damsel in distress Viv Michelle, who gets attacked in a motel by a pair of arsonists and is rescued by Bond. Ironically, Bond doesn't even appear in his own book until 2/3 of the way through the plot. 1963 gave us On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which focuses on Bond pursuing leads to find Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the leader of Spectre. It ends with Bond finally getting married to his new wife Tracy and Blofeld killing her. While a terrorist didn't kill Ian Fleming's wife, it's possible the character of Teresa Tracy DiVincenzo, who was a Contessa in the book, was based off Fleming's own wife, Anne, who had been married to Edmund Harmsworth, the second Viscount Rothmere, prior to marrying the author. On Her Majesty's Secret Service was followed up in 1964, the year Fleming passed away, with You Only Live Twice, which picks up on threads from the previous book and sees Bond travel to Japan in a last-ditch redemption of his career to convince the Japanese government to share radio transmissions from the Soviets in exchange for killing a scientist, Guntram Shatterhand, who was actually Blofeld. Bond succeeds but suffers amnesia and lives in Japan as a fisherman before traveling to Russia to regain his identity. Then we get The Man with the Golden Gun in 1965, which sees Bond return to London after being brainwashed by the Russians. To reprove his loyalty, M sends him to Jamaica to kill Pistols Scaramanga, the title character, who's working with the KGB to destabilize the region. That gets followed up by 1966's Octopussy and the Living Daylights, which is another collection of shorts featuring the titles Octopussy, The Living Daylights, The Property of a Lady, and 007 in New York. Most of these books and short stories have been adapted into film in some way, shape, or form. And that leads us right into Bond has appeared in 27 films. 29 if you count the 2 that were made by a company other than Eon Productions. But we're not going to count those, even if one of them did have Sean Connery in it. While Casino Royale was the first book in the series, as I mentioned before, the first film to be produced by Eon Pictures was Dr. No, featuring Sean Connery as Bond. Connery continued playing Bond from 1962 through 1967 in the films From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, and You Only Live Twice. He was replaced 2 years later in 1969 by Australian actor George Lazenby in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and then came back to play Bond in 1971's Diamonds Are Forever. From 1973 through 1985, Roger Moore took on the Bond role through 7 films, the most of any Bond film actor. Those films in order of release were Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, Octopussy, and A View to a Kill. The late 80s saw a change in the way the Cold War was headed, and Moore, who was in his late 40s by the time he finished A View to a Kill, had decided to step away from the role. Timothy Dalton was cast to replace him, and his stint as the titular spy only lasted 2 films, The Living Daylights and License to Kill, which was the first film to not use a book title and was a mostly original story that borrowed plot points from the Hildebrand rarity. Dalton's performance was mostly praised by critics, and it was probably one of the closest in likenesses to the literary version of Bond. But because of legal disputes between the film production companies, a third film starring the actor was never made, and he walked away when his contract expired. And so began the long wait to see what would happen with the next Bond film, which didn't arrive for 6 years. Dalton's last outing came in 1989, and when he was replaced by Irish actor Pierce Brosnan, we didn't get that performance until 1995 with the release of GoldenEye, named after Fleming's Jamaican estate. Brosnan played Bond from 1995 to 2002 across 4 films, the last 3 being Tomorrow Never Dies, The World Is Not Enough, and Die Another Day. The 90s era Bond was less about political global terrorism for the most part. While GoldenEye dealt with the remnants of the Soviet-era military secrets trying to reclaim the USSR, Tomorrow Never Dies and The World Is Not Enough used terrorism as a tool to drive the profits of both a media mogul's empire and his control of information, and an oil pipeline heiress's wealth, respectively. Die Another Day shifted to a different communist threat, North Korea, and took some pointers from Diamonds Are Forever to an extent. Brosnan's last outing as the character was the first Bond film in the post-9/11 era, which was the last of the more bombastic, over-the-top films with scene-chewing megalomaniac villains holding the world hostage with some kind of super doomsday weapon. The mid-2000s streamlined the character and took Bond back to basics. This started with the casting of Daniel Craig as Bond, and since origin stories were all the rage through the 2000s and 2010s, the studio went back to the beginning and adapted Casino Royale. While the core characters, Bond, Le Chiffre, Vesper Lynd, Felix Leiter, and Rene Mathis, are all the same, the setting is changed to Montenegro, and the game goes from being Baccarat to Texas Hold'em, since it became more popular to American audiences through the World Series of Poker. Bond was stripped down, in some scenes almost literally. The cool secret gadgets were gone. Q wasn't even introduced yet, and this rendition was gruff, physical, and less polished. This was meant to be Bond's first real case, so the film's intro gives the audience a glimpse into how he earns his 00 status, and the investigation he pursues before he's ever actually assigned the case. The only holdover from previous film entries was Judi Dench as M. She had been introduced in GoldenEye in 1995 as the newest intelligence minister, taking over for whomever played M up through the Dalton era. But it got confusing as this was meant to be Bond's origin, and the M from those days would have been a man. Probably best not to overthink it, though. I remember being in the theater with my brother and a group of our friends, and witnessing the visceral reactions my brother's friend Nathan had to Bond's torture scene towards the end of Casino Royale. If you know the scene, you understand how painful it was for a group of guys to watch. But I couldn't help but laugh hysterically to Nathan audibly shouting, "No! Just tell him the code! Oh man, you're never having kids! Tell him the code!" Craig played Bond through 4 more films between 2008 and 2021, with the next being Quantum of Solace, taken from the short story title, though the film's plot piggybacks on unfinished threads from Casino Royale rather than focusing on Bond's involvement in an abusive marriage between a businessman and his flight attendant wife. Then we had Skyfall in 2012, which is arguably one of the best Bond films put to cinema. Then 2015 brought us Spectre, which by this point reintroduced a new version of Blofeld played by Christoph Waltz. He was barely an antagonist, and the real threat came from Andrew Scott's Max Denbigh, which, let's be honest, that felt like typecasting since he was already playing Moriarty in the BBC Sherlock series opposite Eggs Benedict Cumberbatch. Then there was a 6-year gap in the films. Part of this came from Daniel Craig waffling about whether or not he wanted to continue playing Bond for another film, especially after his predecessor, Pierce Brosnan, departed the role after only 4 films. By this point, he had matched Brosnan's tenure and could walk away if he chose. The other part of the delay was the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic, which pushed a lot of projects back.
So excited to tell you that our movie Free Guy is finally headed to movie theaters.
So excited.
Yeah, you've forgotten what the movie's about, haven't you?
What? No.
Eventually, the 5th Bond movie in the Craig era, and the 27th film overall, released in October 2021. It was called No Time to Die. It was a controversial film, to say the least. By this point, with the current trends of Hollywood, describing every male trait as toxic masculinity, there was concern about filmmakers and the studio more or less neutering the character. Rumors dropped that Lashana Lynch was going to be the new Bond. She wasn't. She just took over his 00 status and code number. The film also makes 2 rather monumental mistakes. The first was that they brought back Blofeld and killed him off in the first act of the movie. This was one of Bond's most historic and well-known villains, responsible for killing Bond's wife, at least in the books. And while Bond does technically kill him in the film, it's not a deliberate choice, but sheer happenstance, because Bond has been coded with some kind of nanoparticle that was programmed to kill specific people based on DNA signatures. The second mistake involved Rami Malek as the villain Safin. The trailers and teasers touted him as this terrible villain out to get Bond, and the truth is, he didn't even want to hurt Bond at all. He wasn't even trying to go after any kind of world-dominating terror plot from the beginning. He had been a child when Mr. White, a character introduced at the end of Casino Royale, and sporadically popping up through the rest of the Craig films, killed his parents. His other main goal was to kill all of the Spectre organization members, which he does while Bond looks on in horror. Since White died of cancer, Safin tries to go after the man's daughter, whom Bond married between the events of Spectre and No Time to Die. This whole thing ultimately leads to Bond getting covered in the nanoparticle, and to protect his wife and their daughter, calls in an airstrike on his location at the villain's base of operations, and sacrifices his life at the end of the film. While the book From Russia with Love almost ends with Bond being poisoned to death and subsequently recovering, this last film in the franchise actually killed off the character. Everything up to that point in the Bond era, meaning the Craig films specifically, was contiguous. Regardless of Connery or Moore or Lazenby or Dalton or Brosnan, the character was the same throughout and was hopping from adventure to adventure. Because the films ignored the book's release order sequence, Some changes were made, and each of the films was a standalone, self-contained story. Having grown up when Roger Moore was still in the role and seeing it transferred to Dalton, I don't really remember how interconnected the plots of the movies were. The first Bond movie I remember seeing in theaters was GoldenEye, and throughout the Brosnan era, I remember several repeat characters crossing over through those 4 films. But the Craig-era films were not a continuation like with the previous 5 actors. It was a complete reboot with a beginning in Casino Royale and a definitive ending with No Time to Die. This reboot, which in the era in which it was made, was a popular trend in the filmmaking industry. It had a high-level start and an even higher-level midpoint, and concluded with what should have been a promising but ended up being a disappointing final chapter. While the books dealt with themes like Britain's place in the world after World War II and throughout the Cold War, dealing with the common tropes of espionage, such as double agents and red herring clues, many of the films focused on the spectacle, the camp, and the sexiness of Bond's world. You do get to see those changes in the character and growth in his personal life and the way he deals with his compatriots and the women that he comes to be romantic with. Story-wise, the closest iteration we get to the books is the Craig version, at least in my opinion. We get his personal history in a way that reflects why he is the way he is and operates the way he does. But I think the writers came to a point where they were not sure what to do with Bond because it seemed his trademark chauvinism and overall misanthropic attitude didn't really work within the current political correctness of the modern era. And honestly, it shouldn't. That's the whole point. While it is fun to see a suave and sophisticated spy with a license to kill and a license to thrill, the real truth is that espionage is gritty, it is not glamorous, it is not beautiful. Real intelligence gathering is oftentimes boring, tedious, and while there may be some globetrotting involved, it's not all cocktail parties and high-stakes gambling while wearing a tuxedo. Most spies look like normal people, and you would never know they were a spy until it was too late. In fact, most spies don't operate in the way that James Bond does. I mean, for a guy who's supposed to be a spy, far too many people know that he is a spy, which is kind of a joke that makes a running gag throughout the animated series Archer. Everyone keeps referring to Sterling Archer as the world's most dangerous spy, and he refers to himself as the world's greatest spy. But the whole point of having a cover identity is that nobody knows what you actually are. But I'm curious to see what happens in the future with James Bond. So far, it's been 4 years since the last movie released. There have been talks and fan theories about who the next Bond will be. Many people would like to see Henry Cavill take on the role, even if he is already in his early 40s. Others have suggested that it might be Aaron Taylor Johnson, especially after he became the celebrity endorsement for Omega and their watches. The last time Omega picked a celebrity spokesperson, it was Daniel Craig in 2005, just a year before Casino Royale came out. But this is all speculation. So far, the most recent Bond project set to release is 007 First Light, a video game being released in March 2026, which is set to be an origin story for the character taking place before the events of Casino Royale, the book, not the film. So we'll see how this game resurrects the character after his 2021 film demise. It's been 73 years since Ian Fleming's signature character was first published. In that time, he has gone from pulp espionage provocateur to bombastic movie action hero to video game protagonist, and he even had a nephew, James Bond Jr., who was featured as the central hero of a cartoon released on Fox Kids Network. While some of the character's traits may not play nice with current-day politics and political correctness, there is still a fondness and a love for the character, otherwise titles like the up-and-coming First Light video game would not have been greenlit. Personally, what I think Bond needs is going back to basics. Again, the books themselves are not so long that they can't be properly adapted into film, but why reinvent the wheel? Each of the movies has a place in cinema history. Say what you will about whoever your favorite Bond is. Mine will always be a combination between Connery, Brosnan, and Craig. But I think it's time for a new angle. I think it would be a clever use of studio funding to do a series based on the books. And I mean really basing them off the books. Set them in the years that the books were actually released, starting with 1952 and working through 1964. Make the series a period piece instead of it being set in the modern era. Keep the plots simple and to the point, just as Fleming did. Ignore the campy one-liners and the tasteless double entendre puns. The only special gadgetry should be whatever was introduced in the books, not some contraption like a laser hidden inside someone's wristwatch. Hell, you could actually do 2 books per season. Like I said, they're relatively short, less than 300 pages each. Season 1 could be broken up into 10 episodes, with 5 episodes focusing on Casino Royale, and the second half of the season, which is episodes 6 through 10, could focus on Live and Let Die. And hey, Jeff Bezos, if you and Amazon are listening to this, and I don't know why you aren't, then by all means, I'm a writer, tap me as head writer and showrunner, because I think I can make this happen, and I think I can make it good. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you'd like to support this channel, you can do so through Patreon, both my merch and bookstores, as well as doing a one-time donation through Cash App. If you like this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll be back next month talking about the Jurassic Park franchise. Until then, I'll find you guys in the fiction.